Turin should have reported the gesture immediately. Protocol left no room for hesitation. Any unexplained synchronization during a first-rank diplomatic ceremony, especially one overlapping an orbital anomaly, belonged in the security channel within seconds. Instead, he stood beneath the crystal dome with his tablet dark in his hand while the welcome proceeded in flawless ceremonial order, as if the room had not just drifted within a breath of something dangerous. The failure unsettled him at once, not because he was careless, but because he was not. He had built his career on noticing the details other people dismissed as nerves, coincidence, or personality. The small things were where truth hid before it was ready to be seen. Humanity was granted provisional corridor access, cultural exchange recognition, and a speaking seat in the Outer Coalition Council pending final defense review in 3 cycles. By coalition standards it was generous, almost strangely so. Ambassador Ilara Thorne accepted the decision with exactly the right amount of gratitude. Her voice was calm, elegant, and disarming as she spoke about trust, distance, and the old habit of civilizations meeting weapons before they met language. The chamber warmed to her. Even Sarat, who trusted no rising power until it disappointed her twice, inclined her head. It should have ended Turin's concern. Instead it sharpened it. He had expected relief from a species standing at the edge of acceptance. Relief had a shape. It loosened the hands, softened the jaw, let tension leak from the spine. The humans showed something else. Satisfaction, yes, but not release. Not one of them looked like a people whose future had just been decided by others. They looked like people watching an expected result arrive precisely on schedule. At the reception, the mask slipped again. Jonah Mercer, listed only as a cultural liaison, moved through the observatory with easy charm, drawing laughter, lowering guards, turning simple conversations into careful measurements of everyone around him. He felt less like an attaché than a man checking marks against an invisible chart. When Turin mentioned the power fluctuation, Mercer did not deny noticing it. He only smiled and answered too lightly, the way experienced operatives did when they wanted the truth to remain close enough to feel but never close enough to touch. Then the observatory glass shimmered with a faint diagnostic wave, and for a single instant Mercer's eyes went not to the stars ahead, but to the reflection behind him, checking the room. That was enough to drive Turin into the sanctuary archives before second watch. What he found there troubled him more than any lie could have. The human record was too clean, too responsive, too disciplined. Their diplomacy radiated openness, but beneath it sat a deeper pattern stretching through centuries of conflict, survival doctrine, and institutional memory. Humanity did not preserve peace by forgetting danger. Humanity preserved peace by preparing for its return long before anyone else sensed it coming. Then he found the system's note buried in the maintenance queue. Intermittent deep field mass echo. Range impossible. Signature unstable. Probable lensing artifact. He cross-checked the timestamp against the moment Ilara Thorne had tapped 2 fingers against the stone. 3 seconds. Turin stared at the overlap until the silence around him changed shape. The humans had not reacted to the anomaly. They had reacted to confirmation. And somewhere beyond Orith Prime, hidden in the black between sensor sweeps, something vast had already taken its position before the Coalition finished welcoming Earth inside HFY Dawn Watch. Turin had broken protocol in 3 additional ways and still had nothing he could submit without sounding unstable. He had isolated the sensor echo, mapped its timing against the ceremony logs, checked for duplicate anomalies in the previous 30 summit cycles, and quietly queried the sanctuary's external traffic spine for unscheduled maintenance drones, stealth probes, and shield ghosting. The result was infuriatingly incomplete. There was no intruder track, no weapons bloom, no unauthorized transmission burst, no sign of a fleet staging beyond the world. There was only absence arranged too neatly to trust. Something had brushed the sanctuary's perception and then withdrawn so cleanly it left behind only the impression of mass where mass should not have been. The official explanation remained lensing noise. Turin no longer believed in it even as he kept repeating it to himself. The easier conclusion would have been that the humans had brought hidden force to the summit. It was simple, satisfying, and strategically familiar. A new species seeking admission positioned unseen assets near a coalition sanctuary, confirmed favorable entry, and prepared contingencies in case diplomacy failed. Civilizations had done worse for less. Yet the more Terrans studied the human record, the less that conclusion fit. Their files did not read like the profile of an ambitious power trying to bluff its way upward. They read like the work of people who had spent a very long time rehearsing restraint. Every treaty response was measured. Every concession was real, but never careless. Every cultural exchange opened access while withholding dependency. Humanity had not approached the coalition like beggars or predators. They had approached it like engineers evaluating a bridge from the outside while smiling at the people standing on it. He requested access to non-public transit records under the authority of Behavioral Stability Review and found another pattern he could not unsee. Across 18 years of preliminary human contact, the ships Earth had sent into coalition space had almost never taken the fastest routes available. They favored secondary lanes, older relays, underused jump buoys, and logistical corridors most major powers considered inefficient. At first glance it suggested caution. At second glance it suggested surveying. The routes formed no obvious map until Tran stripped away political borders and laid the lanes against repair density, emergency response windows, and relay age. Then the shape emerged. Humanity had been tracing not where the coalition was strongest, but where it was tired. That realization followed him through the day like a private fever. Publicly, the summit moved into its next scheduled stage: trade harmonics, resource licensing, border language, all the slow ceremonial machinery by which great powers pretended permanence into existence. Humanity remained composed through it all. Elara Thorne spoke rarely and never at length. Mercer did not return to the observatory but appeared elsewhere with uncanny timing, laughing with junior delegates, listening to dock clerks, charming a panel of archivists into explaining obsolete corridor customs no one had cared about in decades. Tran began to suspect that what looked like social ease was actually collection. The humans were not dazzled by entry into the coalition. They were using entry as access. That suspicion should have eased when Sarat herself dismissed his concern. He brought her the anomaly privately, framed it with caution, and expected irritation at worst. Instead she listened in complete silence, one hand resting against the glass wall of her office while stormlight from the dead world below striped the room in silver. When he finished, she asked only whether he believed the humans intended immediate violence. He answered honestly that he did not know. She considered that, then told him uncertainty was not accusation and accusation without leverage was merely theater. "Watch them," she said. "If this is ambition, it will rush. If it is discipline, it will wait." The remark should have reassured him. Instead it made the room feel colder. Because if she was right, and if humanity had waited already, then whatever was unfolding had likely begun long before the summit invitation was ever sent. He stopped looking at the humans as a new arrival and started looking for older footprints. That changed everything. In freight arbitration records, he found human advisory signatures attached to relief convoys routed through failing fringe systems years before formal coalition contact. In sanitation reform grants, he found human-designed compatibility standards embedded in emergency filtration units now used on 6 worlds that officially had no strategic importance. In civil recovery reports after a mining collapse near the Tau Verge, he found an Earth logistics team praised for restoring supply sequencing faster than coalition responders could model it. Each fragment was innocent on its own, too small to matter, easy to classify as the generous overperformance of a species eager to prove itself useful. Together they formed something harder to dismiss. Humanity had been volunteering for the unglamorous parts of civilization: repair, scheduling, redundancy, fallback support, route recalibration, and leaving behind systems that continued functioning better after they were gone. That was not how expansionist powers behaved. It was, however, how patient powers ceded influence where nobody thought influence lived. The first external shock came before he had fully formed the thought. A frontier relay cluster in the vast corridor, long notorious for delays, outage bursts, and smuggling bleed, went active across all dormant channels at once. Not overloaded. Harmonized. Civilian traffic advisories updated in real time. Dock sequencing corrected itself. Emergency traffic windows cleared. By the time coalition monitors confirmed the change, 3 aid vessels had already passed through a junction that usually trapped traffic for half a day. The local governor filed an astonished report crediting an unregistered but fully compliant routing mesh that identified itself only as temporary humanitarian support architecture. Turan read the phrase twice, then checked the transmission format. The coding grammar beneath the message was human. That was when fear became something more useful. Pattern. He pulled 79 hours of summit-side communications and found thin signals hidden inside normal diplomatic chatter, not encrypted in any dramatic way, simply nested in timing, sequence spacing, and harmless service requests. Not orders. Readiness checks. Confirmation chains. The terrifying part was not their existence. It was their modesty. Whoever designed them had expected scrutiny and built around it, trusting that power watched for force more readily than for rhythm. Turan traced 3 of the chains outward until they vanished into civilian routing exchanges. He traced 5 more and found they converged not on military nodes but on logistics hubs, med bays, repair harbors, cargo schedulers. Humanity, it seemed, was not placing hands around the coalition's throat. Humanity was placing hands under its failing joints. By evening, the coalition knew something was happening even if it could not name it. Delegates moved in tighter circles. Side conversations cut off when humans approached, then restarted in altered tones after they passed. Sarat requested silent readiness from local defense wings but stopped short of public alert. Markets on 2 fringe exchanges stuttered after insurers flagged unexplained route stabilization in sectors previously priced as high risk. A merchant consortium filed protest language before anyone had officially announced a policy shift. In one of the lower galleries, Turan passed Mercer again. The human was standing alone this time, looking through a wall display that showed freight motion in simplified lines of light. Calm blue currents crossed the dark like capillaries waking under skin. "You found something," Mercer said without turning. "I found a civilization that enjoys appearing late to events it already prepared for." Mercer smiled at the reflection rather than at him. "Better than arriving loudly to problems you cannot solve. What are you doing to the corridors?" Mercer's expression did not change, but some interior calculations seemed to settle. "Nothing to the corridors," he said. "Only to the assumptions built around them." That answer stayed with Turan long after Mercer walked away, because it sounded less like a threat than a diagnosis. Near third watch, a second report struck the summit channels. Another outer route, this one considered economically trivial, had come alive with the same impossible efficiency. Supply lag collapsed. Navigation errors dropped to 0. Emergency requests from 3 neglected stations were acknowledged within minutes by support craft no coalition registry could place. The systems were not under attack. They were being rescued by an architecture nobody remembered authorizing. Turan went back to the anomaly logs one last time before rest cycle and widened the search radius beyond the sanctuary perimeter. There, at the edge of sensor certainty, faint as a held breath, sat 7 repeating mass distortions aligned across dead space in a pattern no natural lensing field should produce. Not ships exactly. Not stations. Something quieter and older in posture, distributed rather than concentrated, waiting rather than advancing. He understood then that the hidden presence near Orith Prime had never been a summit contingency alone. It was one node in a structure already spread through coalition blind zones, built piece by piece in places too boring, broken, or distant for anyone powerful to guard with attention. Humanity had not entered the coalition to gain reach. Humanity had entered when its reach was already sufficient. And somewhere in that realization was the question that finally terrified him more than the hidden network itself. If the humans had spent all these years preparing to touch the coalition without being seen, why choose now to let themselves be noticed at all? The answer began arriving before anyone asked the question out loud. That was the part Turan would remember later with the most unease. Not the revelation itself, not the panic in the council wing, not even the first fleet alert that rolled through the sanctuary in a whisper because no one had yet decided whether speaking too clearly might make the crisis real. What stayed with him was the sense that events had passed the point of permission. The coalition had not chosen to investigate humanity. It had been placed inside an unfolding proof. By first light, the hidden corridor stabilizations were no longer isolated anomalies. 12 frontier routes had shifted into the same impossible efficiency. Freight lockups dissolved. Famine-risk worlds reported relief traffic arriving ahead of projections by margins large enough to look fictional. Emergency med chains that had been stalled for weeks suddenly began moving as if somebody had cleared invisible wreckage from their path. Coalition models failed almost immediately because the assumptions beneath them stopped matching the world. The old maps tracked ownership, tariffs, defense umbrellas, and recognized relay priority. The new reality seemed to obey a different cartography entirely, one based on strain, fragility, and neglected utility. Humanity was not moving through the coalition as the coalition understood itself. Humanity was moving through the coalition as it actually functioned. That difference reached the council chamber by noon. No formal emergency session had been called, but the delegates gathered anyway, drawn by the kind of gravity that only appears when institutions realize ceremony is about to lose control of events. Elara Thorne arrived exactly on time and took her assigned place as though this were merely another scheduled discussion on transit rights or interspecies archival standards. Mercer stood 2 positions behind her, expression unreadable. "Sir," opened without preamble and requested clarification regarding unauthorized infrastructure activity in recognized coalition space. Her tone was neutral enough to pass as diplomacy, but the neutrality had become effort. She was holding the room together by force of habit. Elara stood. "Authorization depends on what you believe has been built," she said, and the chamber tightened around the sentence. That should have sounded evasive. Instead it sounded almost tired, as if the problem before them had been obvious for too long. She did not deny human involvement. She did not apologize. She only asked the delegates to consider why so many remote systems had become vulnerable to disruption in the first place, why emergency routes had decayed without review, why aid corridors repeatedly failed only when profitability and central oversight both thinned, why so many worlds had been left to depend on a structure that worked beautifully near the core and unreliably everywhere else. She was not grandstanding. She was inviting shame to enter the room under its own power. The Grell envoy accused humanity of coordinated infiltration. A trade minister from the Tal Verge accused them of deploying undeclared strategic assets beneath the cover of humanitarian exchange. Another demanded to know how long the hidden network had existed. Elara gave none of them the answer they wanted. She said only that systems rarely collapse at the moment of failure. They collapse long after warning becomes ordinary enough to ignore. That line should have turned the room against her. Instead it turned the room inward. Too many people there had signed too many maintenance postponements, deferred too many emergency overhauls, accepted too many models that treated outer fragility as a tolerable cost of inner order. Trinh saw it happen one face at a time. Anger remained. So did suspicion. But beneath both something more dangerous was beginning to spread. Recognition. The coalition might not be facing an attack. It might be facing an indictment. That possibility became harder to avoid an hour later when the first historical cache surfaced. It came not from the humans, which made it far more effective, but from an independent archival guild on Mesra 9. Their public release contained declassified records from the fall of the Hadron Compact 2 centuries earlier, a failed trade order most coalition schools now treated as a distant administrative collapse. Buried in the release were policy phrases repeated with chilling familiarity. Temporary route security. Emergency tariff consolidation. Outer ring stabilization delays. Managed corridor restrictions for public continuity. Trinh read them once and felt his pulse accelerate for the first time that day. He had seen nearly identical language in modern coalition memos justifying reduced maintenance priority for low-value sectors. Different order. Different century. Same logic. The same elegant bureaucratic vocabulary that turns suffering into scheduling. The chamber did not empty after that. It fractured. Some delegates retreated to private channels to manage damage. Others demanded human files, relay maps, fleet disclosures. Sarat ordered a sealed review of all frontier dependencies and received, within 17 minutes, a preliminary summary so severe she did not let it leave her desk. Trin only saw the edge of it, enough to catch 3 highlighted terms in red: food bottleneck cascade, med delay mortality, corridor coercion exposure. The quiet coalition had mistaken for peace was beginning to look like deferred collapse. And still the deepest answer remained hidden. That evening, Trin stopped waiting for permission and entered the summit's restricted transit archive under Sarat's dormant authority key, a career-ending act that felt strangely small compared to the scale of the lie now surrounding them. He correlated human advisory visits, relief missions, repair contracts, cultural outreach exchanges, and unclassified engineering residencies across 41 years of peripheral contact. This time he did not search by territory. He searched by failure type: relay lag, fuel scarcity, medical delay, convoy piracy, maintenance fatigue, customs deadlock. He expected clusters. What he found was continuity. Human presence appeared again and again, not where influence was profitable, but where systems approached abandonment. A fisheries crisis on Kethmora. A dust port filtration collapse in the Nairn Belt. School ship supply failures in the Lorne Reach. Weather net interruptions on Vey Hollow. Small disasters. Forgettable sectors. Problems powerful governments solved slowly because the damage remained politically distant. In each case, humans arrived modestly, solved more than they were asked to solve, left behind interoperable tools or procedures, then withdrew without formal claim. No speeches. No annexations. No public doctrine. Just improved resilience in places the coalition treated as administrative fog. The major powers had watched all of it happen and classified it as goodwill. Trin no longer believed goodwill was the correct word. Near second watch, Mercer requested a private meeting. Not through an official channel. Not by invitation bearing weight. Just a location ping in a maintenance garden tucked between the sanctuary's lower data spines where filtered water ran over black stone and sound folded softly into itself. Trin arrived expecting manipulation and found, infuriatingly, that Mercer seemed relieved he had come. "You know enough now to become dangerous," the human said. "That is a strange way to ask for trust." "It is not trust I'm asking for." Trin held his ground. "Then what?" Mercer looked past him toward the narrow fall of water. "Perspective. Before other people give you a simpler version." For the first time since the summit began, the human dropped the performance of lightness completely. What remained was not menace. It was weight. He told Turin that humanity had identified the pattern long before formal admission talks began. Not just in coalition administration, but in older interstellar systems whose failures had been scrubbed into abstractions by distance and official memory. Centralize movement. Price access. Neglect the margins. Translate preventable suffering into procedural necessity. Wait until desperation makes coercion ordinary. Then call the result order. Different flags. Different species. Same cycle. Empires, alliances, compacts, assemblies. The names changed. The mathematics did not. "We didn't build against your fleet," Mercer said quietly. "We built against recurrence." That was the twist Turin had not been prepared for. He had spent 2 days trying to decide whether humanity was ambitious, defensive, deceptive, or patient. The answer was more destabilizing than any of them. Humanity had not hidden this network to spring a sudden rise over the coalition. Humanity had hidden it because the coalition itself was only the latest expression of a wider historical illness. The point was not to survive one order. The point was to interrupt the pattern that kept producing the same kinds of order over and over again. "You manipulated half the frontier to prove a theory?" Turin asked. Mercer's expression hardened. "No. We watched the frontier get manipulated for decades and refused to pretend it was accidental." Before Turin could answer, the garden lights shifted to emergency amber. A public data breach hit every major summit channel at once. Not a human broadcast. A hostile leak. Partial maps of the hidden network flooded the information commons stripped of context and framed for maximum panic. Secret human route control. Embedded transit override architecture. undeclared relay access in sovereign space. Images of dormant deep-field nodes spread faster than fact-check channels could stabilize them. By the time the first verification tags appeared, 3 markets had suspended trade, 2 sector militias declared provisional readiness, and a coalition talkstream was already calling it the beginning of a human logistical coup. The genius of the strike was obvious. Whoever launched the leak could not stop the network physically, so they attacked its narrative. Make the quiet builders look like infiltrators. Turn rescue into conspiracy. Convert every world helped by the mesh into evidence of secret control. Turn understood at once that this was the real battlefield now. Not corridors. Legitimacy. The summit reeled. Several delegates demanded immediate detention of the human mission pending inquiry. Others argued that doing so would confirm coalition panic and trigger further instability. Sarat refused both extremes and sealed the chamber, but her authority was beginning to thin under the pressure. Outside, fleets moved. Not openly toward war, not yet, but into positions from which war could happen by accident, pride, or one badly phrased order. Then came the ultimatum. A core world defense bloc transmitted a unified demand across formal channels. Humanity was to surrender master access to all shadow relay infrastructure, suspend corridor stabilization protocols, and disclose every distributed node within 18 hours or be designated an unlawful coercive actor operating against recognized interstellar governance. The language was legal. The meaning was simple. Hand over the future or be framed as the threat. Turn expected Ilara Thorne to resist, deflect, or bargain. Instead she asked for full-spectrum public assembly. It was a shocking move, and somehow not the biggest shock of the night. Because when the chamber reconvened and the ultimatum was placed on record, Ilara finally revealed the truth no one there had imagined. Humanity could not surrender unilateral control of the network because humanity had never kept unilateral control of it. The architecture had been distributed over decades through local cooperatives, frontier med authorities, civilian repair unions, independent dock charters, school convoys, agricultural exchanges, and municipal emergency councils. The hidden system was not a secret throne waiting for a species to sit on it. It was an ecosystem already shared by the very worlds the coalition had treated as peripheral. The silence after that statement felt physical. The old powers had built their response on a comforting assumption. Somewhere behind the curtain there had to be a central switch, a command vault, a seat of ownership that could be seized, punished, or negotiated into obedience. But the quiet horror now spreading through the room was that no such seat existed. Humanity had not built a superior version of centralized control. Humanity had built a way past it. And if that was true, then the question before the coalition was no longer whether humanity had gone too far. It was whether history had already moved beyond the point where the coalition could order it back. The 18-hour deadline transformed the sanctuary from a diplomatic refuge into the still center of a civilization trying not to fracture in public. Across coalition space, ports slowed, insurers froze contracts, convoy captains delayed launches they could not afford to delay, and frontier stations began rationing with the haunted efficiency of people who had survived supply uncertainty before. The core worlds expected panic to force compliance. It was the logic old systems always trusted in the final hour. Tighten legitimacy, threaten enforcement, remind everyone where recognized authority still lived, and the disorder would crawl back into the margins where it belonged. But this time the margins were watching in real time, and the margins had been quietly learning how much of civilization already rested in their hands. Ilara Thorne did not answer the ultimatum in private. She answered it everywhere. When the public assembly opened, the sanctuary's vaulted chamber became only one node in a live civic field stretching across relays, freight decks, municipal halls, hospital forums, dock unions, school networks, and emergency councils from the inner worlds to the broken frontier edges nobody had considered historically significant enough to matter. It was the first thing that shocked the old powers. Humanity did not respond as a government defending a secret program. Humanity responded as if this moment had always belonged to the public. Every active corridor carried the same offer in clear language, translated into commercial code, aid language, legal shorthand, and civilian emergency formats. Any world, guild, convoy chain, med authority, repair charter, or recognized municipal body could sign a temporary open transit covenant. Signatories would receive audited route transparency, guaranteed emergency passage, shared oversight access, priority stabilization during shortages, and recorded protection against unilateral corridor restriction. No one would be forced into the system. No one would be denied the terms once entered. The network would not belong to Earth. It would belong to every participant willing to make openness enforceable. The brilliance of the move was strategic, but the power of it was emotional. The galaxy had spent generations hearing that fairness was too fragile to scale, too naive for real infrastructure, too expensive for hard politics. Humanity's answer was not a speech about morality. Humanity's answer was a functioning model. The hidden years suddenly made terrifying sense. They had not been spent merely building capability. They had been spent building enough capability that fairness no longer had to beg power for permission. The core blocks reacted exactly as old authority reacts when it realizes legitimacy is becoming optional. They called it coercion disguised as civic choice. They called it procedural blackmail, unauthorized governance, and a public manipulation event wrapped in humanitarian vocabulary. Yet every accusation weakened as more signatures appeared. The first came from a famine risk moon whose med shipments had failed twice in the previous quarter under coalition delay exemptions. Then a convoy union signed from the Tal Verge. Then 3 maintenance syndicates whose workers were tired of being blamed for system strain they had spent decades warning about. Then 2 frontier mayors, then a schooling fleet, then a chain of neutral refuel harbors, then a port insurance collective that cared less about pride than predictable survival. Each new ascent activated route clarity, queue stability, and relief prioritization in visible, measurable ways. The map did not explode into revolution. It lit, one node at a time, with the quiet force of practical trust. That was when the old order made its last serious mistake. A core defense bloc, unable to stop the spread of signatures and unwilling to watch its authority dissolve through consent, moved to seize Junction Helion, a high-visibility relay gate where 3 supply branches crossed under partial coalition claim. Officially, it was an enforcement action against unlawful route manipulation. In reality, it was meant to restore fear. A rapid response flotilla entered the zone with public notice delayed by 6 minutes and tactical permissions broad enough to force inspection, disable unknown relays, and detain any non-compliant craft. Under previous systems, that kind of move might have worked simply because it would have become history before the victims found language for it. This time, every sensor window, escort log, cargo delay, and weapons lock appeared live across the same public mesh the bloc had mocked as illegitimate. The strike did not look like the return of order. It looked like exactly what humanity had spent decades preparing the galaxy to finally recognize. Viewers watched hospital consignments rerouted into holding spirals. Agricultural support barges lose priority beneath armed hulls. Civilian pilots ordered into silence while legal language caught up behind force. They watched old doctrine perform itself in real time and, stripped of abstraction, it looked uglier than its authors had anticipated. Several commanders in the enforcement chain hesitated the moment the optics turned against them. One asked for revised authorization. Another refused to escalate beyond scan range. A third transmitted a private objection that leaked almost immediately, not through sabotage but through the simple fact that too many eyes now stood inside the process. Helion became the turning point not because humanity destroyed an enemy fleet, but because transparency destroyed the story that force was neutral when exercised by recognized power. Inside the sanctuary, the chamber had ceased pretending this was a debate about admission terms. Turin stood behind Sarat as message traffic layered across her console faster than aides could classify it. She had governed long enough to know when a system was merely stressed and when it had begun to lose the right to describe itself in the old tense. Around her, the delegates wore the rigid expressions of people discovering that the vocabulary they relied upon had aged into camouflage. Emergency order. Temporary restriction. Strategic necessity. The phrases still functioned. They simply no longer hid what they were doing. Sarat asked the question the room had avoided all day. Why now? Her voice carried without effort. If your species could do this before, why wait until the brink? For the first time since the crisis began, Ilara's composure changed. Not broken. Deepened. The answer, when it came, was not theatrical. That made it land harder. Because humanity had not acted the first moment it became capable. It had acted at the last moment it believed delay remained moral. Analysts had projected one more decade of corridor coercion, med bottlenecking, subsidy decay, and frontier dependency hardening into self-sustaining collapse. A dozen worlds would survive on paper and fail in function. Another generation of optimization language over catered tables. Humanity had spent years hoping reform could emerge from warning, from participation, from evidence quietly offered in the right rooms. But warning had become routine, and routine had become permission. We did not wait because we were uncertain, Ilara said. We waited because power always claims there is still time to become better on its own. There was not. No threat in the room hit as hard as that. The human split, long visible only in hints, resolved in the open after Helen. Some among Earth's operational command wanted to press advantage, formalize the mesh, lock hostile blocks out until they capitulated, make the hidden years pay strategic dividends while momentum held. They were not monsters. They were frightened by the idea of exposing a system painstakingly built across generations to immediate infiltration and sabotage. Turin understood the fear because he shared a version of it. Once made public, the network would become vulnerable in ways secrecy had long prevented. The safer option was controlled custody. Temporary stewardship. Limited access until the crisis cooled. The old phrases were beginning to tempt even the people who had resisted them longest. Ilara refused. That refusal became the moral climax of the entire upheaval. She declared that if the network survived only by becoming a better hidden empire, then humanity had built nothing worth inheriting. The architecture would remain open, audited, and distributed even if that made it harder to defend. Oversight keys would be shared. Route logic would be reviewable. Relief priority standards would be challengeable in public. The system had been designed to make hoarding difficult, not to prove that humans deserve to hoard more wisely than others. In one stroke she gave away the cleanest path to domination, and by giving it away she made domination much harder for anyone else to reclaim. The effect was immediate and almost disorienting. Worlds that had hesitated signed. Neutral blocks moved from observation to participation. Even some core administrators, once certain the human project concealed conquest, shifted when they realized conquest had just been refused in front of the entire network. Helion's enforcement flotilla withdrew in stages under public pressure and internal legal collapse. The ultimatum expired unanswered because answering it had become less important than the fact that the galaxy no longer revolved around who had issued it. What followed was not peace. It was recalibration on a scale large enough to feel like weather. Formerly minor sectors suddenly mattered because routes depended on them openly now, not as exploited margins but as visible joints in a shared body. Maintenance unions found themselves treated like strategic institutions. Frontier med boards argued on equal feed priority with ministers who had once ignored their petitions. Dock clerks, convoy schedulers, repair engineers, and municipal resilience officers became central voices in assemblies that old prestige had long monopolized. Humanity emerged from the crisis not as owner of the new order, but as the species that had forced the old one to admit what kept it alive. In the days that followed, small artifacts of the long plan began surfacing across the newly public network. Folded instructions inside relay housings. Hand-marked repair diagrams in obsolete formats. Training logs attached to forgotten support hulls. Compatibility notes written by technicians long dead who had designed their work to be understood by strangers decades later. Names attached to incremental acts no one outside a narrow chain had ever celebrated. A traffic harmonics patch authored by a schoolship engineer from 30 years earlier. A medqueue redundancy protocol signed only with initials. A handwritten line taped inside a maintenance panel on a weathered utility craft. Make sure the next failure has somewhere softer to land. Turin saw hundreds of such fragments archived in the first public memory vault and understood at last why the human presence had always felt so strange. The The strength he had sensed at the summit had not come from hidden ships alone, or secret relays, or a clever doctrine kept in sealed rooms. It had come from continuity. From generations of people building useful things without certainty they would live long enough to watch usefulness become history. Late on the 7th night after the ultimatum collapsed, Trn returned to the observatory where his suspicion had first taken shape. The dead world below still turned beneath veils of silver storm. Traffic moved through the dark in calm, visible lines now, less elegant perhaps than the old coalition charts, but more honest. No one had solved power. No one had ended conflict. Some blocks were adapting. Others were regrouping. A few were already searching for ways to bend transparency back into hierarchy. The future had not become safe. It had become harder to hide inside. Mercer joined him without announcement, as if completing a pattern laid down days earlier. For a while neither spoke. "You were right," Trn said at last. The analysts did notice other people noticing. Mercer let out a quiet breath that might have been amusement, fatigue, or both. "And now?" Trn looked out at the lanes, at the ordinary ships moving with no fanfare and no concealment, at a civilization learning in public what it had mistaken for background. "Now," he said, "everyone else has too." That was the final reward humanity claimed from its long silence. Not fear, though fear came. Not dominance, though power shifted. Respect, certainly, but even that was secondary. The deeper victory was this. The galaxy finally understood what kind of species had been standing politely at its edge all these years. A species dangerous not merely because it could fight or hide or plan, but because it could commit across generations without applause, build systems stronger than its own pride, and wait until the moment action was no longer advantageous, but necessary. The silence was over. What came next would be contested, imperfect, and alive. But whatever the galaxy became after Orith Prime, it would do so in the shadow of a truth it could never again unknow.